Hi guys, and welcome to another Dan's Code Snippets. In this one I'm going to talk to you a little bit about methods and functions, which are a really great way to help organise your code. So a method and a function essentially allow you to do two things. They allow you to break up a bigger bit of code into smaller chunks that are more manageable and perhaps have something related to each other. For example, I might be doing some code that reads from a database, so it makes sense to put that in its own little block, which we'd call a method. Another reason I might do a method or a function is because I've got some code that I want to use several times. So I want to repeat it several times throughout my program. So for example, I want to do an about box. Now I may be able to get to the about box from a button. Perhaps it appears when the program first launches, and perhaps it's available as an option in a menu. In all three instances, I want to see the same about box. So if I use a method, for example, to do that, then I only need to write that code once, and I can call it from many different places throughout my program. So let's have a look at a demo of what a method looks like using our about box. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to choose a WP of application, and I'll just call this one about. And once we've loaded the form, I'm just going to add a button to my main window. Now I could also add a menu and put an about menu in there, and later on we might look at how to do that. But for now, I'm just going to add another button because that's something you're already familiar with. And I want the about to appear no matter which button I click on. So first of all, I'll go through and do my naming. So I'll call the first one about 1. And make sure I set its content as well. And the second button we'll call button about 2. Now, you all know how to use a message box at this point, so if I was to go ahead and create a normal message box, this is how we do it. We double click on the first button, then we do our message box.show. Put in our message and our caption and so on. So let's make this one a information. Okay, and there's my about box. Now that's going to work if I run the program, press F5. Click on the first button. There's my about. Of course, if I click on the second button, nothing's going to happen. Now, with what you know about coding at the moment, you could solve that problem by just going back into the designer view, double clicking on the second button, and going ahead and duplicating that code. I won't type it all, I'll just copy and paste it. And we're done. Now both buttons are going to give us the same dialog. The problem is we're actually using duplicate code. So if I make a mistake in one, it may not work, and it means I may not pick up on it because I didn't test that one. I only tested one button, not the second one. It also means if I make a change to one of them and forget to make a change to the second one, then that's not going to be reflected when I do the about. So there's a risk there that I'm going to have code that's not only duplicated, but it's going to be much harder to maintain. If I make a change, I need to remember that I've got to make a change in 2 places. If I add a menu, and I do an about for the menu as well, now I've got to maintain code in 3 places. You can start to see how this can become quite unmanageable when you're working on a large project. So a method is a way that I could just simply have both of these buttons calling exactly the same code. Let's see how I can modify my program to do that. Now I'm not going to change the click events as such at the moment. I'm going to go below those and I'm going to create a method called about. Now I'm going to type private, which tells me that this method is only going to be available to events and other bits of code that belong to this particular window. I'm going to put void, and that's suggesting that nothing's going to come back from the method. You'll learn more about that a little bit later in this video when I talk about functions and why we've got void. So I'll just put that in for now. I'm going to call the method about, and I put 2 brackets on the end. And then I'm going to put a left and right curly brace. And whatever I type in the middle bit here of the about method is going to be what I actually want to run. So to save a little bit of time on this demo, I'm just simply going to cut and paste one of those message boxes that talks about my, or brings up my about dialog. Now, of course, when I click on button 1 at the moment, you can see nothing's going to happen because now we've taken the code out. So what I wanted to do is actually to run this new method I've just created called about. And it's dead simple to do. All I've got to do is type the name of the method, put the brackets on the end and a semicolon. That's now going to call our method and run our message box. I'm going to do the same thing for my second button, like so. Okay, so I've made references to my about method, and now if I run the program, pressing F5, and click on either of my buttons, sure enough I get my about dialog. The beauty of this approach though is if I make a change to my method, so I've now got my super program, let's change that to my super duper program, run the program again, we can see that the change is being shown by button 1 and also being shown by button 2. So effectively I've only got one place I have to go to now to maintain the code about my about dialog. Now this is a very simple example, and a lot of programs that you might write, you could write quite a lot of code. So breaking things down into these logical little groups makes your maintenance much easier. It means you can split responsibilities so other people can take their share of the work and contribute to your projects. It also means if you're not quite sure how to do the about dialog, for example, it doesn't stop you from putting a reference to about and writing a method. And maybe the method has nothing in it initially, but it just helps you to think through and plan what your code's going to look like when you finish. And you know at some point you're going to have to come back and put those details in about how to do the about dialog. Okay, so that's a simple example of a method. So what's a function and how is it different from a method? Well, in fact, if you read a lot of documentation online, you'll see them refer to a function as a method. It's really just a variation on what we've just done. Let me create a new project and show you a classic example of how you might use a function. So I'm going to do a new project. I'm going to select WPF again. I'll call this one calc. Okay, so we've got it up. So what I'm going to do is just simply add one button. I'll call this one total. Okay, change the content as well. Right, double click on the button. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to call something like a method that adds two numbers together and gives me the result. So I can then display that with a message box. So I've got my click event there, and now I've gone below the click event and I'm going to go ahead and write some code that looks remarkably similar to what you've just seen as a method. So let's start with private, and normally when I do a method I would type void. Now what the void bit tells .NET is you don't expect to get anything back. You want to call this method, but you're not expecting to give you any answers back when it's done. We're going to do a function, and the difference is with a function is we expect it to tell us something back in return. It kind of makes sense in this application because what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask it to add two numbers together. And when it gets the answer to the two numbers, I want it to give us back the answer. So a function giving us back an answer is a good fit for this particular example. So I'm going to take out the void part and I'm going to put in what kind of answer do I expect back. So in some cases, for example, you might want back some text, so you'd put string. If you're just going to be dealing with whole numbers, you might want to get back a number, so you'd put integer. If you expect to work with something like decimal points, you might want something like a double, so you can do fractions and things like that. So you're just going to look through the list of available variable types and determine what kind of answer do you want your function to give back to you. To keep this first example nice and simple, I'm just going to use whole numbers, so I'm going to use integer, which is something we're familiar with. Okay, next I've got to put in the name. So I'll call this add. Then my brackets, and then my left and right curly brace. So the only thing I've changed at this point is just taking out the void reference and replace that with the type of variable that I want to get back as part of my answer. Okay, or data type, I should say. So how are we going to do it? Let's just say that when we call this, it just comes back with the result of 2 plus 2. You can't change it. It always comes back just with the answer of 2 plus 2 for this first example. Later on, we're going to have a look and see how we can make it a little bit more useful than that. But for now, let's just do that. So with a function, we have to return something. So I've put in the return statement. And then we return an answer. So I could do something like this. And what that's going to do is add 2 and 2 together, get the answer 4, and then give that back to me in my click event. So let's look at the click event now and see how we deal with it here. Now I want to take the answer and I want to show it to everyone in a message box. So I'll start typing the message box in first, messagebox.show. Then I need to call the function, and if you recall, the function is called add. So I'll do that. And I'll put my 2 brackets on the end. Now it's going to come back with a number, the number 4. If you recall, a message box can't work with integers and numbers, it can only work with strings. So when I get my answer back, I'm going to have to convert it to a string that message box can work with. And I'm going to do the toString on the end of my on the end of my function call there, and that will convert the answer back. And then finally, I'm going to finish off with a semicolon on the end of the line. So let's just review what I've done there. I've called a message box, which is calling a function called add. Add is going to add 2 and 2 together and come back with the answer 4 as a number. And then the last bit I'm doing is a toString, which is converting that answer that comes back into something that message box can work with, because it needs to work with a string. Let's see how it works. I'll press F5. We'll click on our total button, and I get back the answer 4. So we've called our function, it added the numbers, came back with the answer, and then we're able to view it with a message box. So that works great. Of course, it's a bit limiting at the moment because we can only ever work with, in this case, 2 plus 2. It'd be nice if the program would ask us, what numbers do we want to add up. Maybe we're going to use this in multiple places in our program, where we can add up 2 numbers. So let's see how we can make a change to our function to make that possible. Now here's our function here, and you'll notice when I said add, I just had left and right bracket on the end. I didn't put anything inside those brackets. Well, we're now going to add something inside, and what we're going to add is what's called parameters. Parameters are values that you want to pass to your function, or indeed to your method. So what I'd like to do is pass to the function the 2 numbers I'd like to add up, and then get them to add up and pass back the result. And this works a little bit like variables. So when you see this code, it will look a little bit like what you do when you set up a variable. So remember, I've got 2 numbers that I need to pass to my add function. So I put int to explain it's going to be a number, and then a description, like you do with a variable, of what you're going to call the first one. So I'm going to call mine first number. Then I'm going to put a comma, and I have to describe what the second one's going to be. Well, the second one is also going to be passed as a number, so I put int, and then I give a name for the second parameter, which is second number. So now my function expects not only to receive, or not only to be called add, but when I call it, it expects me to give it 2 numbers. And I can tell it expects that because if I go up and look at my message box again, we can see now that a red squiggle has appeared underneath my add function. And if I hover over it, IntelliSense tells me that this doesn't make sense, because if you read the top line of that IntelliSense, it's saying it expects to get a first number and a second number as parameters. So let's do that. Let's put 10, comma, 10. Notice how IntelliSense is coming up and saying first number, second number. So it knows now what to expect. So at this point, my function is called add, and I'm passing the number 10 and 10, and they're getting put into my function. But I'm not doing anything with them, because at the moment I'm still just adding 2 plus 2. So I'm still going to get the answer 4. What I want my calculator, my add function, to do is in fact take the two numbers that I passed to it and add them together. So I'm going to modify this return. Let me just keep the original one there by commenting and show you what the new one looks like underneath. So I'm going to go return first parameter called first number plus the value of the second parameter called second number, semicolon. So now we pass the numbers 10 and 10. It's going to add 10 and 10 together and give us back an answer. So if all works well, we should get 20 as our answer when we run it this time. Let's try that. So I click total, and we get 20. Works great, so we're getting a different number. Now remember the first example I did with the method, I had 2 buttons? Let's go back and revisit that for a minute. I'm going to add a second button to my function. And I'll just call this one total 2 so it's a bit different. And I'm going to get it to call my exact same function. So double click on the button. I'm going to do a message box, .show. It's going to call my add function. Only this time, instead of passing 10 and 10, I'm going to pass 20 and 20. Whoops, sorry. And of course I've got to remember to put in the toString as well so it converts it. So 2 buttons, 2 click events, both calling exactly the same function, the add function, but using different values being passed to it. First one's passing 10 and 10, second one's passing 20 and 20. Let's see if it works. Okay, so we're going to click on total. First one gives us 20. Click on total 2. Second one gives us 40. So now we've got a practical example of a function. We can change the values going into it, and it'll give us a different answer every time, but it's exactly the same code that's being used by both. The same function, the same add routine is being used by both. And this is the beauty of methods and functions, that you can repeat the same piece of code multiple times through your form, through your window, or through your entire project, or even through an entire solution made up of several projects. And this means you can come up with some really simple code and just keep reusing it. Makes it much simpler to understand what you're doing, much easier to maintain it. And that really ultimately is the whole goal behind methods and functions. We're going to finish off with one last thing, is how could I do this just using a string, just as a second example of the idea of a function. So just quickly go through it. New project, WPF app, I'll call this one names. And what I'm going to do on this one is I'm going to add, once we come back, there we go, I'm going to add a text box. In fact, I'll add 2 of those. So we want a first and second name, last name. I'm going to add a label, which will show the answer from our function we're going to write. So I'll make that a bit longer so we can see it. And I'm going to add a button, which is going to go ahead and put the 2 together and give us a result. So, first of all, name my controls. So the first one's, instead of text box 1, is going to be text box first name. Second text box is going to be text box last name. The label is going to be called label full name. And the content, which is currently set to label, I'm going to just delete that so it's empty, because our function is going to fill that in for us. And the button, I'm going to change that from button 1 to button full name, and I'm going to call the content on the button full name. So the goal of this particular project is we're going to type our first name in, our last name in, click the button, and what we should see in our label is our full name with a space between the first and second name. Okay. So let's double click on our button to get our code view up and get our click event happening. There it is there. Now before I fill in click event, I'm going to actually go ahead and create the function I want. So I'm going to type private. Now remember, a function returns something, so we can't have void. If it's got void, it's a method, which means it doesn't return anything. We do want something back this time. We want the full name, and the full name is going to be a string. So I'm going to tell it that we're returning a string. Then I give the function a name. In this case, full name makes sense to me. Then we can put something in the brackets for the parameters, the bits that are going to be passed to it to make up the answer. Well, the bits that we want are coming from our form, those two text boxes. So what I can do is I can say string, because that's what the first one's going to be. And I'll call the first one fname, and then a comma, string again, and lname for the last name. Okay. And then we'll put our left and right curly braces in. Remember, in C#, we always have a left and right curly brace, and the do bit goes in between them. So where I am now with the cursor, I'll zoom in a bit there to make it easier for you to see. Where I am now with the cursor is where I've got to write the actual function that's going to join the two names together and return the result. Now, I can do that in one line of code, which is what I'd probably do normally, but in this example, I'm going to show you how we could do it with 2 lines of code, because I want to show you how we can use a variable for this. So I'm going to create a variable called full name. It's a string, and I'm going to say that we're going to say that full name equals fname, which is your first name, plus, and then we're going to put in quotes a space, so it's just quotes with a space between them, plus lname, and then a semicolon. So what we're doing here is what's called string concatenation, which is a fancy way of saying we're adding some text together. And so what we're doing is taking what's the first name, then adding a space, and then adding the last name. And the result of those 3 things, the adding of those 3 things, is being put into a variable called full name. The last thing I have to do in my function is a function returns something. So I'm going to type return, and I'm going to type the name of the variable. So we create a variable inside our function, we concatenate the strings to get the full name, and then we return the result, which is the variable full name with the concatenation done. Now, in my click event, I can go ahead and actually do something about calling that function I've just written. So I'm going to say that label full name dot content equals the function called full name, and then I have to pass to it the first and last name I want to join together. So they're coming from, if you recall, text box first name dot text, comma, then the second parameter, which was text box last name dot text, and then we put a semicolon on the end. So what we've got now is we're saying the label, the content of the label rather, is going to equal a function called full name, which is going to be passed the text box first name and the text box last name as values. It's going to join them together inside the function, come up with the answer, which is full name, and then return the full name back to us. Now, unlike the last example where we used toString, we had to use that toString bit when we were calling the return bit for the message box, because what we were getting back was a number, an integer. But in this example I've just coded, we're working just with strings, so there's no need to convert it back to string. It already is a string, so I can miss that step. Let's see how it works. I'll press F5. There's our project, so I'll pop my name into the text boxes, click on the full name button, and I get back the result of the function, which is my name with a space in there between the first and last name. And of course, it doesn't matter what I type in, it's going to work just fine. So this is a classic example of how we could basically use a function to take something that we might want to use more than once in our project, or something that's sort of self-contained, which is kind of is, if you think about it. Its only job is just to add names together. We can make that like that and use it. This would be great, for example, in a database project where we're pulling out of a database last name and first name out of different fields in a database, and we'd like to join them together again before you see them on the screen, so that they're the way people expect to see names written on the screen, rather than just, separate names somewhere off left and right of the screen. So we just put them back together again so they're easy to read, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so you've seen an example of a method which can also have parameters, but remember, a method doesn't return anything, it just does whatever's inside the method. And you've seen the example of a function which allows you to actually return something back to your code. And the goal with both the method and the function is to reduce the duplication of your code and to make it easier to put code into logical groups, into logical collections of things of what they do, like this one, which brings back a full name, and the previous example, which was like a calculator that added numbers together. Hope that was useful for you. If you've got any questions, as always, feel free to catch up with me, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks.